Welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hello, my dear audience. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And of course, you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Goodpods, whatever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza, on Blue Sky Social as Let's Talk Micro, and I have an email address which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So either via social media or via email, you can reach out with any suggestions, any feedback. They are always welcome and appreciated. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. Thank you so much for the support. And as you know, the Let's Talk Micro podcast does not have any sponsors. So if you want to support the podcast in any way, you can do so via Venmo or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, both links available on the show notes. And if you are looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. Definitely some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. Okay, so if you haven't had the chance to check out the previous episode, definitely go ahead and do so. It was about my favorite organism, Pasteurella multocida. And those of you that have been listening for a while, you know that early in the podcast I did an episode about Pasteurella multocida, and this time I had a guest, which was Dr. Kelly Maddock, and she was previously a guest on the episode that we did about veterinary microbiology. So that one also was a great episode. So in this episode, she came in to talk about Pasteurella multocida. And it is very interesting because in the lab, we think about Pasteurella and we see it on samples and we don't think much about it from the animal side, right? From the veterinary side. And it's very interesting. In the episode, she starts with an overview of Pasteurella multocida. Then she moves on to talk about capsular types. And she talks about diseases in animals. She talks about the different capsular types. She talks about a paper they published on looking for these capsular types using moldy-tough-MS, which that was definitely very interesting. And she also talks about hemorrhagic septicemia. So definitely a great episode. So if you haven't checked it out, please go ahead and do so. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about today's episode, which is actually the next episode on the AMR series. So in the episode, Andrea and I are joined by David Allen from bioMérieux, who's a pharmacist, and we talk about a group that you in the lab might be somewhat familiar with, maybe not that much. And for sure, you have tested in the lab one drug in this group, which is linezolid, and the group is the Oxazolidinones. And I said it very fast. So the episode starts with, as we always do with this type of episodes, we break it down. So the episode starts with Andrea actually pronouncing the name of this group, and then we move on to a historical overview. We talked about mechanism of action, organisms that the drug has activity against, any intrinsic resistance, can we apply the interpretation of one member of the group to another? So definitely a great episode, and it is great to learn about a group that maybe, as I said before, we might not be that familiar with. So all in all, a great episode. So let's go ahead and listen to it. Hello, my dear listeners. Welcome to another episode of the AMR sub-series. Those of you that have been listening for a while, as you know, we have an AMR series within the Let's Talk Micro podcast, where, in the spirit of Let's Talk Micro, we break down antimicrobials. We talk about things like mechanism of action. We talk about, which organisms is the drug intended for, has activity. We talk about intrinsic resistance. We try to make it as simple as we can. And of course, we cannot have this segment without my wonderful co-host, Andrea Princey. Hey, Andrea, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Surviving.
Yeah, you hanging in there.
Yeah, it's been definitely a few weeks, but
You're very busy. I know.
yeah, getting through it. But we're almost there. Um, just I'll continue doing what I'm doing, and it'll be over soon. But yeah, definitely some challenges.
All you can do. And hey, speaking of learning and working hard, you know that I love to learn new things, right?
Yes, I do.
This is like one of my favorite things. Okay, well, I'm so excited that today we're covering a class of antibiotics that I cannot pronounce. So that's new for me. I'm very excited about it. I'm hoping that you all will help me figure this out.
Yeah, that's it's funny that you say that because I remember when I saw that. And of course, once we actually talk about the antibiotics in this group, the audience is going to recognize them and they know they have worked with them and things like that. But I was kind of doing the same thing. I was kind of like Googling watching like maybe some videos of people pronouncing them to make sure that we kind of got it right. But definitely we'll learn how to pronounce it after this episode is over.
Well, thank goodness we have our guest who's going to just clear it all up for us.
Definitely. So you want to go ahead and introduce our guest?
Yeah, I'd love to. Okay, so very excited today. We have another good friend of mine. This is Dr. David Allen. He's a graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University School of Pharmacy and completed 2 years of residency, including a specialty in infectious diseases. And since then, David practiced as an infectious diseases clinical pharmacy specialist, with the majority of his time as the lead ID pharmacist for the antimicrobial stewardship program at the Inova Health System. In this capacity, he focused much of his efforts on implementing rapid diagnostics to support antimicrobial stewardship. He now practices within medical affairs at BMRU with myself, with yours truly, as a field medical director, which I absolutely love. I don't know if David loves it. We'll let him answer that question later, but I love it. In this role, he works with key opinion leaders from the largest health systems, and the focus of his work is on helping to bridge the gap between the patient care needs of these top health systems and BMRU's diagnostic pipelines. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Andrea. And yes, of course, I love working with you. But I do think before we start, we really need to hear your pronunciation of this class in question because I've yet to heard anyone actually commit to it.
Oh no. Okay, no shame in this game because we're all learning together. Let's go with oxazolidinones.
Not bad. Oxazolidinones,
Sound like I sneezed?
it's phonetic-ish for something with so many letters.
Okay, so we can live with that, right?
Yeah, it's funny because I was gonna ask David to say it first, and then he went ahead and asked Andrea. So now the audience knows how to pronounce it. So there you go.
Or
Well,
do they?
yeah, well, yeah, I guess you can play this many times and hear it. And um, definitely, I want to say, I thank you, David, for taking the time to do this, and welcome to Let's Talk Micro podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. So, when we always, when we start this type of episodes, I think we always, we like to start talking with a general description of this group, and if you have any historical facts to share, also, they're always great. So let's go ahead and start with that.
Yeah, sure. So the class is really made up of two antimicrobials. It's a linezolid and tadizolid. And so the oxazolidinones as a class are really have been known chemically for a long time. They were originally discovered and found to be weak MAOIs or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And that's a class of antidepressants that we don't use a ton these days. And really, these antidepressant effects were found to be generally pretty mild, and MAOIs are pretty notorious for their side effect profile and drug-drug interactions, which is relevant to this class still, certainly. But really, the antimicrobial effects were far more impressive than their potential use for antidepressives. And so linezolid was first FDA approved back in 2002, and tadizolid was approved in 2014.
Okay, so yeah, definitely fairly recent. Yeah, 2002 was a very notorious year for me because that's when I was in basic training. So changed my life completely. Okay, so thank you for that. Um, so can you go ahead and David, can you go ahead and tell us about the mechanism of action of these antibiotics?
Yeah, sure. They are one of the many protein synthesis inhibitors in the antibiotic space. In this case, they have a unique binding location that doesn't have any cross resistance with others in the protein synthesis inhibitor group, though. It's to the 23S portion of the 50S subunit of bacterial ribosomes. Not gonna lie, that's a mouthful that I don't really readily know without looking it up myself either. So really, I think of it as a unique protein synthesis inhibitor, and the uses for it are really, it's effective for a wide range of gram positives. They're both, very good options for MRSA and VRE in particular. And then Also for nocardia and mycobacterium. That's where I have actually used them quite a bit in my practice previously. But usually they're reserved for really MDR isolates of these because, well, they're very toxic agents.
Okay. Thank you for that. And yeah, so to the audience by now, we have covered definitely different mechanisms of action of these groups. We have covered two that target the cell wall synthesis. We have talked about protein. So definitely, I invite you to check out those episodes if you haven't already. I always like to ask about intrinsic resistance. Is there anything that the audience should know about?
I mean, honestly, it's largely what I didn't describe just now, which is, instead of gram positives, it's all gram negatives, and anaerobes are really not covered by linezolid and tadizolid. But for gram positives, they're pretty active overall. And again, some of the more unique organisms like nocardia and your AFBs, it's active for.
Is that because I'm just thinking about, I think it's always more obvious to me when we're talking about like, like a peptidoglycan layer or something like that. But is this do gram negatives not have the portion of the subunit that they bind to, or do you know why that is that they're intrinsically resistant to those groups?
Good question. And that's something I often want to know myself to try to help remember. Uh, in this case, I don't think that there's anything that unique about it. There's honestly a little bit of activity I was finding for some gram negatives, but it's not anything to, really write home about. So it does, I don't believe it's related to the target itself. I would think it's probably more related to just difficulties entering. Uh, that's often the case is, just gram positives. Getting into a gram positive is different than getting into a gram negative because of the extra cell membrane. But I don't really have great information to base that off of.
No, I think that's helpful because I kind of think of this group as being a little more like foggy for me. I mean, I just don't, in general, I don't think we learn a lot about them, at least on the laboratory side. It's like these are the drugs I feel like get a lot of add-on requests or, they're on the report, but you're like, well, they're probably choosing something else, whether they are or not, I don't know. And so I always just wonder whether I feel a little foggy about this group and it doesn't seem as straightforward to me. So that's really interesting. And that actually leads me to my next question about why a clinician, what are all the reasons why a clinician might choose one of these over another? Obviously, I think linezolid is something I'm familiar with, and we used in my previous life in the laboratory. We reported that out all the time, and but never did tadizolid, right? If I said that right. So why would you choose one over the other? What are all the reasons for that?
So the main reason that people choose linezolid, in my opinion, is price. It came out first. It was going generic right around the time tadizolid was released. So I feel like tadizolid kind of got a bad rap just from that standpoint of people were used to linezolid already, and they, had been having to be very selective with linezolid previously because it was quite expensive when it came out, and then it went generic, and tadizolid came out at a pretty high price point. But I do think tadizolid, has some place in therapy, and I actually think it's pretty unique. But I'll tie it all back to really adverse effects. Like that's really what is unique about this class is they have a lot of significant adverse effects, but then tadizolid is generally less on some of these. And I think, there are cases where that really should outweigh. And so I mentioned earlier that, the class as a kind of structurally, they are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And so what that is it's a, antidepressant class that they block the breakdown of serotonin. And so it'll therefore increase serotonin. You can potentially get serotonin syndrome from this class. But usually it's only when combined with other serotonergic agents. And that's because most other antidepressants increase release of serotonin. So, increase release and decrease breakdown, that gets to a potentially dangerous situation. With that said, honestly, most of the evidence is that these are weak enough MAOIs that that's rarely a concern, but it's something to be aware of. And generally, tadizolid is thought to be less likely to cause this drug-drug interaction to the point where actually when it came out, it was marketed as not having this risk. So that's one potential reason is if you're concerned about or drug-drug interactions with the medications. The other large group of adverse effects that these medications are associated with are mitochondrial toxicity. And so the reason for the mitochondrial toxicity is something that I kind of wonder if you two are aware of. We have a lot of protein synthesis inhibitors, and they generally do a pretty good job of targeting bacterial mitochondria, but not necessarily our own ribosomes as much. Sorry, and really, why would there be an issue with protein synthesis inhibitors targeting our own mitochondrial ribosomes, but not our regular ribosomes? Any thoughts?
Gosh, I have no idea, and this is fascinating. Luis, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, same here.
All right, so it's a little, far back history lesson where it's thought that mitochondria actually originated from phagocytized bacteria that were, utilized for energy production and just be kind of over time became part of our own cells. And so the ribosomes of mitochondria are actually more similar to bacterial ribosomes than your other ribosomes in your cells. So some of these protein synthesis inhibitors can, to some degree, reduce protein synthesis in your mitochondria. And most of them, it's not that serious, but for the oxazolidinone class, you can get significant myelosuppression, particularly thrombocytopenia and anemia. You can experience peripheral and optic neuropathies, and even lactic acidosis. And
Wild, David.
yeah, and luckily, you can go a little while without too much protein synthesis in your mitochondria, but about 14 days or so, these side effects really start taking off. And so, honestly, in my practice, I'd feel pretty comfortable the first 14 days given linezolid, but then once it got far past that, I got a little antsy. So you can imagine when I said earlier, mycobacterium as a potential use for these, that's a long-term therapy. These drugs are scary in long-term use. And the way we get around it, though, is generally try to, dose reduce. Linezolid's usually 600 twice a day. We'd go to like once a day, and maybe even half the dose once a day for these long-term uses. But finally getting to the point is tadizolid really doesn't cause the mitochondrial toxicity to the same degree as linezolid. We don't have tons of evidence of this, but it really does appear to be less. And I mean, particularly thrombocytopenia. I've had a ton of patients that I've given thrombocytopenia to when I'm treating, particularly M. abscessus. That was the organism I saw the most that I would reach for linezolid for just because it is so MDR oftentimes. And I mean, my patients, they'd have severe thrombocytopenia to the point where we just really didn't feel comfortable continuing any longer. And I switched them to tadizolid, and quite a few, their platelets would recover and be fine for, months on tadizolid. So I think that's a particularly, niche but really interesting group is if you need long-term use and you're getting some of these mitochondrial toxicities, particularly the thrombocytopenia, tadizolid does not seem to be as associated as linezolid. And then I do have one other reason to actually avoid tadizolid, though. And so this is, I'm going to take you back on a tour of conference history 10 years ago at, I believe it was 2014 ICAC in DC. So I was a, little baby ID pharmacy resident, and this was my first ID conference. And I think ICAC stopped like a year or two after that, which I miss. But I was there, and like tadizolid was, one of the hot new drugs. So I went to every session related to it so I could know about it. And there was a session that still to this day I think is the most interesting conference presentation I've been to. And it really, because it married the, pharmacology and microbiology, and it was direct from the researchers, and it was just information that isn't really well known. And that was based on a CID article by Tom Lodis and Dr. Drusano, and it looked at neutropenic murine thigh models and found that tadizolid just utterly didn't work if in neutropenic thigh models. Their passion of how odd this was was evident. And there was like the package inserts are crazy that they don't really focus on this much, but literally you had to give 25-fold higher doses of tadizolid for it to even work for a neutropenic thigh model, which, is not the same as a human, but still, that's kind of scary. If, giving it to a neutropenic patient, you would need 25 times higher dose potentially. That's concerning. You hear something like that on its own and you go, okay, well, does this really translate to, actual practice? And part of the thought there is, well, no one's going to be kind of, it's scary to study that. You don't want to risk that in a neutropenic patient. So what's the, plausibility for this? And they did also find that tadizolid, it concentrates in macrophages and to a point where it's about tenfold higher concentrations in macrophages than just in the general bloodstream. And so, to me, I thought this was super interesting is it's like the tadizolid is just kind of taking a taxi right to the infection. It's hopping a ride on white cells and getting dropped off at the infection, and you can get away with a much lower dose of it basically because it's targeted like that. But you need to know if you have a patient that doesn't have white cells, you lose that targeting, and the drug really doesn't work well.
This is mind-blowing. This is really this is really fascinating, David. I have a couple follow-up questions to this. This is really interesting. My first is to Luis. Are you guys reporting out any MICs on tadizolid, or do you test that routinely in any way?
No, I think that when you started before David went on the explanation, this is definitely a group that we do normally we don't I guess we don't know much about, and in the lab, I mean, we just test linezolid, and even then, that's about we know that we tested like it's in the Vitek card that we use for gram positives, and then if the Vitek card terminates, we do have gradient strips for it, and we test it, but as far as learning much about it, no, but we don't, Andrea, just linezolid.
Okay, so then that's my other question, David. So, I mean, I feel like the risks and benefits are like very heavy on either side, right? Like you've got this, tadalafil doesn't really have this mitochondrial toxicity issue, which seems like a huge consideration for linezolid in particular. I mean, for both, but um, yeah, especially with like AFB, right? And then but you've got this other, in people that have white cells, you've got maybe this like direct to the source lower dose option. So if at centers that are using this, or if you're getting MICs for this, is there like a comment that goes out with this to kind of advise folks on that kind of use, or just from like a clinical perspective, if labs were to report this out, is there like messaging that comes with this, or just do the clinicians know these data? Like,
I've never really seen messaging at the hospitals I've worked with. I mean, generally, largely tadalafil is considered susceptible if linezolid is, and so really it would be more of a linezolid is intermediate to resistant. Maybe you would ask for tadalafil additional testing in some specific scenarios, but for the most, like for mycobacterium, I actually don't think that there even is a breakpoint for tadalafil. It's really just linezolid, and you're going to have to, kind of assume, because it's not been studied extensively. I mean, it's been studied some, and there's, some interesting cases out there from various groups, but, this is not something that is, backed by a ton of evidence.
right, I guess that was my other question too. Do you feel like use isn't as extensive because there's not as much data available for this one? That's really interesting. And actually, you already started to answer Luis's next question, I think, so we should pivot to that, which is about inferring susceptibility from one of these drugs to another. Luis, was that your next question in line?
Yes, it was, and I always like to ask it because it's always and especially if you get those requests in the lab and you want to know, and now that we have talked about that, maybe sometimes people don't even know that much about linezolid, and if you get that phone call, at the end of the day, and it says, okay, yeah, hey, can you test, tadalafil, can we, like, sometimes, the great example of tetracycline that I always bring, can we apply like the susceptibility, like if linezolid is susceptible, which you said it, but maybe you can talk more about that as far as organisms and things like that.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I am not the expert on this to the same degree that you all might be. I did look at CLSI and tried to, you know, confirm what I thought, but Generally, yes. If linezolid is susceptible, you can often assume tadalafil will be as well. And I've got some of the wording that they use. And so, like Staph aureus is one of the major ones that you would use linezolid or tadalafil for, particularly MRSA. And it does say that if it's susceptible to linezolid, that then generally you would be able to consider this susceptible to tadalafil. However, some organisms that test resistant to linezolid may be susceptible to tadalafil. So there is, potential opportunity there in those, fairly rare circumstances, but it can happen. And then E. faecalis specifically, it says similarly that if it tests susceptible to linezolid, you're good on tadalafil. But then intermediate or resistant to linezolid, it may be susceptible to tadalafil. But then the interesting thing to me is that CLSI really only comments on faecalis. They don't comment on faecium. I honestly was not sure why exactly. It looked to me like they probably just didn't have enough data on what the breakpoint should be for tadalafil exactly for it. But they don't really say that you can use linezolid as a surrogate either. I did find some studies where people did it and it seemed like it worked out okay. So it's not like it's intrinsically resistant. But yeah, I thought that was odd that there was not, more information on faecium. And then Mycobacterium, they do not have CLSI breakpoints for tadalafil, so you generally have to just assume if linezolid susceptible to tadalafil would work. But, again, that's not based on a ton of data either.
Yeah, this is interesting because we're starting to this is one of the, we haven't had a ton of this kind of discussion yet on the podcast. So I think it's probably important to touch on it here because this is a great place for it with this class. But, we've talked a lot. We go through the same set of questions with every drug class, like, are there any breakpoint changes we should know about, et cetera. But it's good to talk a little bit around, about like what you already mentioned, some of these drugs may not even have breakpoints established for given, bugs. Yeah, at least not for CLSI. I don't really know what UCAS is doing. I haven't looked it up recently. I'm not sure if you have any context on that, but I think this is important for laboratorians to know too, that, there may be send out testing or antimicrobial susceptibility testing performed for a drug where you can get an MIC, but there may not be interpretive criteria established because if we, think back to some of our introductory episodes on how breakpoints are established, we know that that includes a lot of clinical data, MIC distribution data, pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic data. And if there's just not a lot of data for a given drug, we may not have enough to establish a breakpoint for, a bug drug combo. So in that case, David, I'm going to mix up the questioning just a little bit here. And instead of asking about any recent breakpoint changes, because it's not totally relevant here, I guess if you could comment just a little bit more on how clinicians handle managing a patient or treating a patient when there's not a breakpoint set. When I was at my old life in pediatric clinical micro, if clinicians were asking for an MIC on a drug we didn't have breakpoints for, we would say, go look through the literature and see what you can find that might help guide you. I mean, do you think that's how clinicians are handling this? Is that what you did in your practice? If you could talk about that a little bit, I think that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say specifically to tadalafil, almost no one ever asked me about this drug because this was a, very niche kind of ID pharmacist type of drug that most providers are not aware even exists a lot of times until you use it that first time. So to any ID pharmacists listening, always be careful with that first time you offer up a new drug because it's going to get asked for a whole lot more afterwards and more often afterwards. So make sure it's a case that really needs it. Because yeah, I've had that experience a lot of times where I'm like, okay, like that patient really needed this. This patient doesn't, and it's like each time, it's a lot softer of a call. I feel like in my experience, but yeah, to make these kinds of decisions initially, it's to your point. I mean, really, it's delving into whatever evidence you can find on these topics and just kind of comparing, like is this a case where you truly need to go outside of standard practice and take that leap of faith that you really don't have susceptibility testing to go off of. And I think that's extremely case by case and should be reserved for those extreme examples where yeah, like you have a patient with M. abscessus and it's susceptible to, two drugs, and one of them they are, going to potentially die from the side effect before they would even finish therapy and they need it, then okay, yeah, let's try the tadizolid. Maybe this will help. And luckily I've had positive experiences there, but I would not be surprised if others have had, the opposite anecdotal experiences. But luckily I did find at least, some case series and whatnot to base that off of. So I'm even more scary if you're the first person to ever do it. Um, it's even more of a leap. But yeah, I think that's really the case is, if providers asking, like, you should always be asking them like what kind of evidence they've been, they've reviewed, and if they really say nothing, then if they have an ID pharmacist, we're often the ones that are happy to do that deeper dive. And this is the kind of thing that I'm happy to stop telling people to stop to narrow their Zosin and do a deep dive into this instead, because honestly I think it's interesting, and I think it's potentially has a huge impact to have these kinds of examples. And I mean, frankly, I think also just, there's experts out there that, even if your institution doesn't have anyone that really knows here, I've certainly reached out to guideline authors before and, had good responses from them at times, or, people that are the ones publishing this kind of evidence. If you bring a, you want to have a discussion about a case with someone like that, they'll oftentimes respond to you and, be happy to talk if you've really, shown that you've done the work to, you know, say that there's really nothing published, and maybe they have examples where they've used it, and at least get some kind of information from them.
Yeah, well, no, definitely. And I just want to say, what, such a great question. Especially as someone that, I mean, I've always been so curious about what happens, outside of the lab. Um, it also hasn't always, been good for me, being that curious, I guess, but I still do it and I love it. But such a great question because, we normally, when we're working in the lab, we don't think much. At least maybe some people, right? We do the testing. If the drug is, it's indicated for the organism, and then, it doesn't have a breakpoint, we release it with some sort of comment saying there are no established breakpoints and something like that. But definitely, it was so great hearing about, the thought process after you put that drug out there and what's happening. So I just want to say, great. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. And thank you, David, for the explanation.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say also, like, honestly, if you can report any kind of MIC, that can always be helpful to at least, even if it's not approved for that drug, to give you kind of some information. If it's clearly through the roof, then all right, move on. But beyond that, I think also the source of the infection is huge. That's another piece of information that I would always be looking for, is what is the concentration of this drug for that source? Is it concentrate super high in the urine where I'm going to feel more comfortable that it's going to potentially work, even if it's something that really doesn't have a lot of evidence? Or is it, pretty mediocre concentrations in the CNS, and, it's probably a lower likelihood? And so that's another piece of information that, it may not be directly related to this bug and drug combination, but you can at least, extrapolate some thoughts.
I love that, David. That's super helpful. I think it's really nice for our laboratory and colleagues that listen to this to just hear the clinical perspective related to things that come out of the lab. And I think, we try to standardize and operationalize things so much, which is really important, but you do get stuck sometimes where you've got clinicians requesting something where we don't have this clear-cut process, or there's not a breakpoint or something. So I think that's really, really helpful. Um, my last question for you is, usually here we ask if you have any comments on how we should be testing for these drugs in the lab. So anything you might have to say about that, but specifically more around how you think it's beneficial for labs to report these out, any sort of cascade reporting or anything like that, I think is helpful for people to hear, especially since we know that the laboratory testing may be a little more limited in this class just based on what's available commercially and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think, testing for linezolid for staph, particularly aureus and enterococcal species, makes sense. Uh, and especially MRSA and VRE, if they're susceptible, you're rarely gonna, be reaching for this. Not just from a, cost perspective, but also a toxicity perspective. This is not a first line agent for much of anything, but I'd say VRE and MRSA, it's a fair first line option, honestly, in some scenarios. And then For streps, I don't know. I really think it's necessary. Um, so I'd say, MRSA, VRE, definitely for the linezolid. And then tadizolid, I mean, again, you can extrapolate in most scenarios, so you probably don't really need to test for tadizolid often unless you do have a linezolid resistant isolate, in which case I think that would make sense to see if MRSA or VRE would be susceptible in those cases. And then again, Mycobacterium and Nocardia, I think are, linezolid's been on the panels that I've seen for Mycobacterium oftentimes, and particularly your more resistant ones like Abscessus. But then also, TB, like it's the B-PAL regimen is become more and more common these days for tuberculosis as well. So I think for your Mycobacterium, it should be, linezolid upfront tested for all of them. Because oftentimes, like, even if it's not your first line treatment option, you have a fair number of options. All the therapies for Mycobacterium are toxic, especially, I mean, pretty much everything can be toxic over the course of months. So having, knowing what your options are up front is super helpful for Mycobacterium.
And actually, while you just said that, you just mentioned the regimen for mycobacteria and you used an acronym. Can you explain that?
Oh, you're gonna make me look that up.
Sorry, or just like generally speaking, is that just like the widely accepted regimen for treatment and that for therapy, and that includes like linezolid, for example?
Yeah, so the linezolid is the L in B-PAL. So it's bedaquiline, protonamide. I'm picturing in my head, I think the A is lowercase. So I think, what is the A? The A, I don't remember off the top of my head. I can look that up real quick. And then the L is linezolid. It's pretty effective. It's a couple of therapies that have not been, super commonly used until more recently. It's ripe up front, the rifampin, isoniazid, um, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol for TB generally. But then if it's MDR, BPAL has a fair bit of data for being better than a lot of other options. Again, they're also toxic that I don't really, I'm not going to claim it's better tolerated by any means, but it's a good option, I think, and is being asked for more and more for if you have any resistance for TB. And I did just confirm it is just those three drugs: bedaquiline, protominid, and linezolid for BPAL.
That's great. I think I don't know, we haven't obviously gotten into like drug groupings or like, but mycobacteria, I think for the audience, everybody I think is aware that they're very complicated in both how we isolate and identify them in the laboratory and then how they're treated. And so I think it's helpful for people to know there's like a bundled approach or regimen for mycobacterium if folks weren't, aware of that.
And particularly that's specifically TB.
TB, perfect. Sorry to put you on the spot, David.
Oh, you're fine. I always told my residents if you're gonna use an acronym, you better be able to, you know, tell me what it is, and I pulled that on them constantly, so I deserve
Maybe I'm
that.
just paying you back for making me pronounce this class at the very beginning. We've come full circle.
In my defense, that regimen really kind of took off in my like last year of clinical practice, so I've only used it a couple of times.
Wow, definitely, thank you for that. I just, as you were talking about also mycobacterium, and I always like to bring a little bit of the perspective in the lab, and just, it always reminds me that when we know we have nocardia or mycobacteria, we know we're going to have a long day in the lab, especially when it comes to staining and other things, because there's some extra steps that have to be taken. But, you definitely have taken, David, a group that maybe laboratorians don't know much about, and you have given so much information about it. So this is so great. And for the techs out there, I always like to say, make sure that you get familiar with your resources. So get familiar with the CLSI. You have that binder in your department. Somewhere in your department, you can access it online. At the very least, get familiar with the sections, maybe know where it's at, and that way you can access it. It's just, we have a lot of moving parts in the lab. We get sometimes, this type of request, and just because you get it doesn't mean you have to, we get into that cycle. We get the request, someone performs the test gets reported. So we need to be more careful sometimes, and get a little bit more educated in that sense and make sure that when we're releasing our result out there, it's accurate and that we should actually be releasing it. So just make sure you know your CLSI. As we wrap up the episode, Andrea, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think this was great. Just like last week's, I feel like I learned so much on this episode that I had no idea. So thanks, David. This is great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So, and you, David, do you have anything else that you want to add for the audience?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for if you made it this far to learning about one of what I think is one of the more interesting antimicrobial classes that I've used in practice.
Well, once again, definitely thank you for your time, and for the audience, as you listen to this episode, you have homework. We have to make sure that you pronounce it right. That way, we sound like we know what we're doing. So, and definitely check out the other episodes while you're at it. It's always great talking to you, Andrea and David. Thank you for taking the time to be in Let's Talk Micro.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Luis.
My pleasure. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about the Oxazolidinones. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. This is very important to learn this as part of our work as microbiologists, so we have a better understanding of the testing that we do, knowing about these drugs, right? So definitely this was a group that we might not be too familiar with, as I said. So please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. And of course, stay tuned. Great things coming your way. I am so grateful for your support. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, David,
Continue talking micro.
continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.